The Declaration of Independence was famously adopted on July 4, 1776, penned by Thomas Jefferson and passed to declare the United States' independence from Great Britain. This cutscene is glitched in Assassin's Creed 3. The title card has the wrong date, an accidental carryover from a previous scene. So we're already off to a terrible start here. Thomas Jefferson isn't in the base game and wouldn't make an appearance until the alternate timeline DLC. The less said about that, the better. So you'd be forgiven for thinking Benjamin Franklin authored the document, given he gets the most prominence in this scene. He did sign the Declaration, that's accurate, but he's not the answer United States Citizenship and Immigration Services is looking for. I'd have botched 2 of the questions AC3 even covers if I'd just studied with a straightforward playthrough of the game. All 4 questions about the Declaration are pretty easy, but the only one this cutscene answers is, what did the Declaration of Independence do? I hope this goes without saying. Do not do this. Do not study for a history test with a piece of historical fiction. However, if you're like me, and you find games in the active play useful as mnemonic tools, Assassin's Creed 3, the American Revolution entry in the series, is a fascinating title to look at while studying. The game highlights the interesting gaps between what the government asks you to know, what years of American art and poetry have led us to know, and what truly was. Back in 2012, Ubisoft created a truly fascinating mosaic that sits in a weird place at the intersection of all 3 points. At one point, Connor bafflingly accompanies Paul Revere around on his famous ride.
Keep going! Keep going! No. Turn around! Where we want to go is behind us!
If someone was backseat driving me this badly, I'm sorry. The British aren't coming. They've come, seen, and conquered, and I'm halfway up Canada.
Does any of this look familiar to you, Connor?
Revere doesn't make an appearance on the test, but what's always been intriguing about him is how his ride has been memorialized as much by Longfellow's famous poem as it has by history. So, 2 versions of him exist in the public consciousness. As historical figure, and as poetry, he appears in history books, and also splashed on the pages and verses of popular culture. Make no mistake, Assassin's Creed 3 is more poetry than history. The history often acts as footnotes for its database. The famous moment of the Founding Fathers signing the Declaration into effect is a major one in the game, and feels genuinely cool to quote-unquote witness, the way you might in a theme park ride through famous moments in history. But if you want that accuracy, you'll have better luck with the game's encyclopedic database. If the game acts as poetry, its database splits the difference with real history, but that poetry and history do work together to stir pathos about the events of the past and to make us laugh, but to also get us to look ahead. So did I replay Assassin's Creed 3 to study, or did I use my test as an excuse to replay a game I liked and see how it might feel in this moment? Probably the latter. While the process didn't necessarily help me study, it did have one identifiable benefit, testing-wise. It helped me with retention. It placed many of the history questions in context. It gave me emotional, and more often, funny anchors to them. What it also helped me learn, that the test didn't, were nuances. The Declaration wasn't signed all at once, reads the game's codex, but over the span of a few months following July 4th. Before we proceed, it's worth noting what the original intent behind the test was. On the heels of the revolution when AC3 is set, it was up to the states how they would receive foreigners coming in through their borders. There was no standardization, and some judges wouldn't even test people on American history and civics before approving them. Other judges did, citing the, quote, attachment to the principles of the Constitution that became considered necessary for naturalization in 1802. Judges would quiz orally in open court, and without a pre-established set of questions. According to USCIS, questions were often impromptu and at the judge's discretion. They could ask things as arbitrary as, how high is the Bunker Hill Monument? And you couldn't be sure of what you had to study. The process was disorganized, and there was no semblance of objective measure, opening up the possibility for candidates to be racially or ethnically discriminated against. The INS, precursor to USCIS, established the first official naturalization test in 1986, and USCIS evolved it further in 2007, with the hope being that standardization would make things fairer, and candidates wouldn't be judged arbitrarily anymore. The test has continued to change with buffs and nerfs and additions for important social and historical context, and look, the bottom line is, this standardized version I took addressed a lot of issues that previous iterations of the test have had. But immigration continues to be a complex issue for America and for the people it is relevant to, especially at the time I'm making this. In this video, I'm just going to be focusing on the test I took in early 2025, and I'm hoping it'll be a bit more casual and lighthearted than my usual fare. I think we could use that. If you need to study for the US citizenship test, the best way to do so is the easiest. There is a list of 100 possible questions you can find online, and you will randomly be asked 10 out of that list. You need to answer 6 correctly to pass. Knowledge of that list is all you really need. I have combed through the 100 questions and color-coded them green for 1. How much of it feels like general knowledge almost anyone living in the US would know. So there are questions like, who is the current president? Who is the current vice president? And what are the 2 major political parties in the US? By my count, about 20 to 25 questions fall into this category. There are more, like, what is freedom of religion? But the phrasing and detailing of the answers are pretty specific, so I didn't count anything where the answer seems intuitive but the wording might not. Then I color-coded in blue 2. How much of it is covered by Assassin's Creed 3? There is some overlap between these categories. For instance, who was the first president, and who was the father of the country are both common knowledge. George Washington plays a prominent role in Assassin's Creed 3 and is explicitly identified as the first president in the codex entries. What is surprising is how little reverence the game has for him. The protagonist, Edward Kenway, or Radon Hagedon of the Mohawk tribe, initially holds a great deal of respect for Washington, but comes to learn he ordered the attack on Connor's village years ago, the one that kick-started his journey to join the Assassins and fight for peace in the first place. Washington did, indeed, order attacks on several indigenous peoples as part of the Sullivan Expedition, which the game recreates, though Ubisoft takes some big creative liberties with the timing and chronology of these events. After their famous celebratory 4th of July trailer back in 2012, a clear marketing tactic to stir up patriotism and interest in their American audiences, I was impressed by how critical the actual game, proper, could be about the Founding Fathers overall, especially on my recent replay. Its choice of protagonist and willingness to acknowledge the racism and hypocrisy of the period, especially in its codex entries, mark it as a distinctly unromanticized story. There's a moment where you step out of a meeting where the Founding Fathers wax poetic about freedom, and then, wandering the halls, see enslaved NPCs scrubbing the floors and cleaning up around the area. Resident snarky historian Sean Hastings puts it best.
Your politicians are constantly referencing the Founding Fathers and insisting they must have been in support of one thing or another. I have never seen such a blatant disregard for history.
That's just typical political propaganda.
It's also dishonest and delusional. How can anyone claim to know what these people wanted based off scraps of paper and wishful thinking?
The game shows that many of the famous figures of the time were deeply flawed people, not just products of their time, but producers, and that the freedom that emerged from their efforts came with asterisks involved. It also navigates all this without painting any group of one of helpless victims without complexity, or any outcomes as inevitable. This also nicely set up future AC titles, like Black Flag, Freedom Cry, and AC3's direct companion Liberation, to tackle slavery more directly. As a side note, this is something that frustrated me about the DLC, a series of bonus episodes that follow Connor and Washington through a vision of what things might have been like had Washington snapped. What if he'd become a tyrannical king? The premise is funny and silly enough. Connor has superpowers, and at one point Washington builds a giant pyramid to himself in the middle of New York. But it is bizarre that the ending returns us to AC3's canonical reality. Washington ponders what he just saw and decides, ha! I would never do that. The original release was willing to portray him as a complicated figure and to leave things off with a major rift between him and Connor.
Whom can we trust now? If patriot heroes are betraying us.
You reap what you sow.
Here, in the DLC, he's suddenly shown as someone with unshakable virtue, as if the only conditions under which he could be imagined as antagonistic would be as a cartoon villain. This alternate timeline also debuts Jefferson. Remember, he wrote the Declaration, and sets him up as a rebel leader and man of the people. He was a flawed figure and a slave owner in real life too, but the DLC implies he should be president if King Washington falls, that he would not only be the best successor, but an ideal one. By all accounts, the DLC is maybe Assassin's Creed 3's America at its most romanticized. The base game is by no means radical or even realistic, but it is at least comfortable with discomfort. Interestingly, though maybe unsurprisingly, none of the questions on the civics test acknowledge the Founding Fathers' faults. The test isn't very comfortable with discomfort either. It doesn't acknowledge the very active role colonists took in the wiping out of indigenous peoples. There are 3 questions about slavery on the list. What group of people were brought to the US as slaves? And then 2 others about how Abraham Lincoln freed them. We're strictly focused on the positive contributions of US presidents. There are 2 about Native American groups also. Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? That's an easy one. And name 1 Native American tribe in the United States. Assassin's Creed does cover this one, though Mohawk, the people Connor is a part of, isn't on the named list. Iroquois, who the Mohawk categorize as, is. Overall, AC3 covers about 15 to 16 of the 100 questions. If you were to use it as your sole textbook, your odds of passing would be quite low. But hey, non-zero. Why am I doing this? I don't know. Why are you watching this? However, you would also get a fuller picture of pre-America than you're asked for. Maybe it was dumb of me to think we'd cover more than 16% since the game is mostly pre-America. Assassin's Creed 3 ends on a sour note, highlighting how the freedom Connor and the Patriots fought for has only come to a few. To white colonists, primarily, but there is still so much work to be done. The civics test is designed to be straightforward, something that could be boiled down to multiple choice if needed. But real US history is complex and multifaceted, and in many cases, damning. AC3 and its sequels, with all their creative liberties, are able to explore that in ways the test can't. This is why I bring up the DLC. Although it is the farthest from reality the title ever goes, it is emotionally contiguous with the test. It acknowledges the same historical complications the original title did, but primarily in caricature, only as either a thing of the past, already resolved, or as something outlandish that wouldn't go on to have lasting effects for generations to come. This feels, to me, like what the test with its very limited scope implies as well. The main story is a lot more raw and real, comfortable with leaving off open-ended, and that open-endedness lingered in my head as I reflected on what kinds of values I'd care about as a US citizen. These games are obviously not a good way to explore this material. You'd have better luck with a history or civics book, or almost literally anything else. But for me, they offered some silly, much-needed enjoyment amidst an otherwise dull process. And some much unexpected enrichment too. Here's the good news. 9 of the questions AC3 covers are from the Colonial Period and Independence chapter, which has 13 questions overall, so it's actually pretty good for that specific section. Why did the colonists come to America? For freedom, political liberty, religious freedom, etc. Why did they fight the British? Because of high taxes. Taxation without representation.
Though the taxes may be small, they were enacted and enforced without our consent. As to their use, they pay governors and judges. And if it's Britain pays them, it's Britain to whom they are beholden, not us.
What are 2 rights in the Declaration of Independence? Life, liberty, etc. The game ends before the Constitution is written, so you'd miss that question. Unfortunately. For reference, it was drafted at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Assassin's Creed 3's Codex mentions the date it was ratified, which was 2 years later in 1789, so I'm not counting it. But learning this side by side at least made for an interesting distinction, and that distinction helped with retention. The process offered some laughs too. What was Benjamin Franklin famous for? Every time I brought up this question to my friends, they would comment some variation of, the kite, or he's on the $100 bill. I'm sorry to report that neither of these is a listed answer. The most memorable thing about him from AC3 is an approximately 5-minute long optional conversation in which he waxes poetic about loving older women.
And that brings me to my 4th point. With age comes prudence. An older woman is less likely to reveal your indiscretions.
Yes. I suppose you know quite a bit about that.
It would be a baffling inclusion, if not for the fact that large parts of his monologue are lifted verbatim from letters he wrote. I was worried, when I learned this, that I would start giggling if I were asked this question, and immigration officers are not funny people, all for an answer that is probably less acceptable than kite? Luckily, I wasn't asked any questions about him. One of the listed answers, though, is that he is known for being the writer of Poor Richard's Almanac. This is one that AC3 made all too easy to remember. You chase down almanac pages in the game to help Franklin restore his book. So, score. We learned something, we retained something.
You actually found something?
Also, the test identifies Ben Franklin as the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention. How old were these women? I marked those two questions about the Declaration of Independence in red because AC3 botches that moment in one of its most important cinematics. However, it does have and at least know the correct answer. The Codex correctly recounts this moment as July 4th, 1776 and identifies Jefferson as the author. In this way, he is acknowledged in this capacity in the base game. So if you catch this error in the cutscene and double-check the Codex, AC3's count goes up to covering roughly 18 of the 100 questions on the test. Alexander Hamilton, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, is also mentioned in the Codex despite Connor never meeting him. His authorship isn't mentioned in his Codex entry, so I'm not going to count this question as covered. If you need a mnemonic for that one, watch Hamilton, I guess. Again, the Animus database is a better textbook than the dramatized events of the game proper. One of the possible questions is, why does the flag have 13 stripes? It's because there were 13 original colonies, and you can also be asked to name 3 of them. Connor's adventures primarily take place in Massachusetts and New York, so that's 2 right there. AC3 names all 13 in the Assassin Recruits menu, where you can deploy your assassins in training to missions in these various colonies. So just pick any one of these and make sure you say Massachusetts, not Boston. New Hampshire, there you go. There's a geography section that can ask you to name one state that borders Canada, and you can see from the map here that New Hampshire is a solid bet again. You could also opt for New York, home to the less good view of Niagara Falls. There are 2 questions about which ocean borders the east coast of America and which borders the west. I nitpicked here. AC3 covers the first answer. Connor's father sails across the Atlantic to come to Massachusetts in the game's opening sequence. It doesn't cover the second, but you should probably know that one. No, I'm not going to be more specific. The other historical questions go into the 1800s and beyond through the World Wars. The only one of them I will generously count is, what territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? Because it's Louisiana, the setting of AC Liberation. Although Liberation doesn't span to 1803, it takes place in France-controlled Louisiana and made the answer extremely easy to remember, at least for me. Le Moyne in Red Dead Redemption 2 is also based on Louisiana and is explicitly a former French colony, so there's a second reminder for you. Who says games can't be decent teachers? I do. That's the point of this video, I don't know why I wrote that. Okay. History and geography notwithstanding, most of the other questions, and the actual tough ones for my money, have to do with understanding the current structure of the US government. So candidates are expected to know the names of their senators, and US representative, and the current Supreme Justice. These answers change with time and with location, so it's worth double checking. I played AC3 for roughly 2 months leading up to my exam, while also studying with flashcards from the list. And how did I do? Well, let's see. The first question I was asked was, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thankfully, I said Thomas Jefferson and not Ben Franklin. Next, I was asked, who is the father of the country? George Washington was easy enough. I mean, he's easy enough in the game too. Oh man, I punched King Washington. If I pass this test, I think I get to vote for his successor. Is that how this works? My third and fourth questions left the history books and came from modern day. Who is the current Speaker of the House of Representatives? What is the political party of the current president? These 2 don't have fixed answers on the list because they change around, but I got them. When do all men have to register for selective service? Between the ages of 18 and 26. My sixth question was, why are there 13 stripes on the American flag? This one is implicitly covered in the game, which features the original flag. Because there were 13 original colonies. Drumroll. I got all 6 of my first questions correct, so they didn't bother asking me all 10. My final tally was that AC3 covered 50% of what I was asked, which was shockingly high. For your viewing pleasure, you sickos, I'm testing myself with 4 more questions at random. Okay, these are multiple choice, so they're easier than the actual test proper, but I got all of them easily enough. Unfortunately, none of these 4 are covered by Assassin's Creed 3, so yeah. In addition to the civics test, you are also tested on literacy. I was asked to read 1 sentence and write 1 sentence. Throughout the process, your USCIS officer is also stealthily evaluating your conversational English. During my prep, I was constantly affirmed that this was not something I needed to study for, and sure enough, it was very straightforward for me. But it's worth noting that English fluency is a legitimate barrier for many candidates. There are people who've lived in America for much longer than I who might struggle with some of these phrases, or even just pronunciations. Since this is one of those things about the test that isn't truly standardized, it introduces an element of subjectivity that is going to be very dependent on your immigration officer. If there's one bit of serious advice I can offer, it's that you should not express political opinions to your officer. You know, like a true American. Mine did make a joke about current political figures and I just laughed. I found out later that they support the party they made the jab about, so yeah. No idea what their intent was. For the most part, if you've been able to follow this video, you'll hopefully pass that bit. But, what did this exercise teach us? It might sound like I'm trying to critique Assassin's Creed 3 for its lack of accuracy or contextualization, or the naturalization test for its lack of nuance. But the truth is, its lack of nuance is nuance. The test should be straightforward. Its official implementation did make things fairer. The fact that you only have to study these 100 questions makes things relatively simple. The truth is, I am in a privileged place where I was able to play a video game and quote-unquote study more material than I was expected to, just because I like to learn. I'm also privileged in that I learned English at a young age and read a lot, even before I moved to the US, for higher education no less. Now, I teach English in higher ed. Not everyone sitting for this test gets to be so fortunate. I've lived here for 10 years with a spotless record. How many people have been here even longer and yet been denied the opportunity to earn their green card, the funds to afford an immigration lawyer, let alone a chance at naturalization? How many are undocumented by happenstance, dreamers, refugees, people who have called this country home longer than I have, while having little to no say in its politics? According to the test, anyone living in the country gets to have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, not just citizens. But in reality, like Connor, we can see those freedoms stuck with asterisks depending on who you are, what you look like, and where you come from. This is so much the thesis of Assassin's Creed 3. Freedom comes, but freedom for who? Like all its sibling titles, AC3 is a theme park ride through iconic moments in history, but as a title created in 2012, it is also distinctly a 21st century piece of art that prompts the player to look ahead. What did America mean then? Who got to define that America? What does it mean now? Who gets to define it today? During downtime, Connor spends his days at a location called the Homestead. The land belongs to an old man named Achilles, a retired assassin leader and Connor's mentor. Achilles is a black man who owns property in the 1760s. Throughout the game, he and Connor invite other immigrants and underrepresented friends into their fold to build a thriving, welcoming, egalitarian community. The homestead feels less like a real place and more like a proof of concept, an idyllic afterlife that still feels idyllic here in real life, centuries later. There's no history to be learned here. It's full poetry, as so much of the game's story is. In fact, most of what you do on the homestead is tomfoolery. Help a friend court his crush. Kick a poacher off a cliff. Pretend you understand these stupid minigames. Or do this weird QuickTime event where you break up a fight between two dudes. Maybe the stupidest minigame of them all, but that's fine. AC3 might not have taught me much US history, but it helped me relax. It helped me reflect on the values I'd care about as a citizen, about how important I think basic education is, and about how art and history work together, and about how underappreciated both things are in the current landscape, how vital it is to champion both things as a voter. And now I can. On most days I would end this video with some long-winded conclusion about what this all means, but today, I just want to share some laughs and sit with those questions. For myself. I just want to celebrate that I got to replay a game I really like during a very stressful time, and that it helped me take some of that stress off. The oath ceremony was clearly an emotional moment for everyone I was in attendance with. That means a lot. It is a little weird they made us legally swear by Abe Lincoln's soul to call football soccer for the rest of our lives, but that's the price you pay sometimes, I guess. It took me a long time to get to this point. On the upside, now I get to champion the things I care about because, oh, here's the corny thing. I'm a US citizen. Or, in the words of another video game protagonist, hey Arthur, what are two rights in the Declaration of Independence? Onward we go.